If you open an old map from 3 or 4 centuries ago, you might notice something strange. Scattered across the continents are names of countries that no longer exist. Some of them are completely unfamiliar today. Yet on these maps, they appear as if they were once part of the normal political landscape. Even more curious, the same mysterious countries sometimes appear on maps created by different cartographers in different parts of Europe. In some cases, these places remain on maps for decades, even generations, and then, almost suddenly, they disappear. The borders change, the names vanish, and history seems to move on, which raises an interesting question. Why were cartographers drawing entire countries that today are almost completely forgotten? For centuries, maps have been one of the most important tools for understanding the world. Long before satellites and digital navigation, they were the closest thing people had to a visual record of geography and political power. Governments relied on them. Explorers carried them across oceans and continents. Merchants used them to navigate trade routes that connected distant parts of the world. In many ways, maps were more than just drawings of land and borders. They were documents of how people understood the world at a particular moment in history. Because of this, cartographers were often treated as careful record keepers. Their work was expected to reflect the best information available at the time. When a country appeared on a map, it usually meant that travelers, diplomats, or merchants had reported its existence. Maps were not simply imagination. They were attempts to document reality. But when historians began to look more closely at older maps, a strange pattern started to emerge. Across many of these maps, entire countries appear that no longer exist today. Some of them are barely mentioned in modern history books. Others seem to vanish from the record almost completely. In some cases, their borders stretch across vast regions. In others, the same mysterious country name appears again and again on maps created by different cartographers. Names like Tartaria, Gran Colombia, the Kingdom of Araucania and Patagonia, the Republic of Cospaia. Some of these places were real political entities that existed for a brief moment in history. Others remain far more difficult to explain, and when these maps are placed side by side, they reveal a world that looked very different from the one we know today. When historians look at old maps that show countries no longer recognized today, the first step is usually to search for a conventional explanation. In many cases, the answer seems relatively straightforward. The political world of the past was far less stable than the one we know today. Borders shifted constantly. Empires rose and fell. Entire nations appeared, disappeared, and sometimes merged into larger political structures. The historical record shows that many of the names found on older maps belong to real political entities that no longer exist. Large empires once controlled vast regions that have since been divided into many separate countries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, once dominated much of Central Europe. Today, its territory is shared by several modern nations. The Ottoman Empire once stretched across parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Over time, its lands were divided and reorganized into new states. More recently, even countries such as Yugoslavia existed for decades before eventually breaking apart into several independent nations. Because of this, historians often argue that many of the strange names on historical maps simply reflect earlier political realities. They were countries that existed for a time, then disappeared as borders changed. But political change is only part of the explanation. Another factor is the way maps were created in earlier centuries. Cartographers rarely worked in isolation. They often relied on existing maps as references. When a well-known map maker published a new map, others frequently copied its information. This meant that mistakes could easily spread. A small error in one map might be repeated by others for many years, sometimes even for generations. There was also a more basic problem. Information about distant regions was often incomplete. Many parts of the world were still poorly explored. Cartographers depended on reports from travelers, merchants, and explorers. These reports were not always accurate. As a result, maps sometimes included lands that were misunderstood, misnamed, or only partially known. Because of these limitations, historical maps occasionally show incorrect borders, unfamiliar names, or places that seem difficult to identify today. At first glance, these explanations appear reasonable. Political change, copying errors, and incomplete information could easily produce strange results on old maps. But when researchers begin comparing large numbers of maps from different places and different periods, another question slowly begins to emerge. Some of these mysterious countries appear far too often to be explained by simple mistakes alone. At first, these explanations seem convincing. Borders change, empires collapse, maps contain mistakes, history moves on. But when researchers begin comparing large collections of historical maps, some details start to feel harder to explain. Certain countries appear again and again across maps created in different places and in different decades. They are not shown once or twice. They remain on maps for long periods of time, sometimes for generations. This suggests that the cartographers who drew them believed these places were real. One of the most well-known examples is a region often labeled as Tartaria. On many European maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, this name appears across vast areas of northern and central Asia. The territory is enormous. In some maps, it stretches across thousands of miles. What makes it particularly interesting is that the name appears on maps created by many different cartographers. These map makers worked in different countries and different periods, yet they repeatedly used the same term to describe this immense region. Today, however, the name Tartaria is rarely used in modern historical discussions. The lands once labeled this way are now divided among several modern states and regions. The original label seems to have faded from common historical language. Another example comes from a much smaller place. In central Italy, there once existed a tiny independent state known as the Republic of Cospaia. According to the historical record, this unusual republic managed to remain independent for nearly 4 centuries. Despite its small size, it appeared on regional maps for hundreds of years. Then, in the 19th century, the republic disappeared. Its territory was absorbed by surrounding states, and its name slowly vanished from most modern maps. There are also cases where countries existed only briefly, yet left a surprisingly large mark on historical maps. Gran Colombia is one example. In the early 19th century, this nation covered an enormous portion of South America. For a short time, it included territories that today belong to several different countries, but the state itself lasted only a few years before breaking apart into smaller nations. When maps from different years are placed side by side, the result can be striking. Entire countries appear, expand, and then vanish within a very short period of time. In some cases, the political world shown on one map can look completely different from the one drawn just a few decades later. And this raises an interesting question about how quickly the map of the world can change. To understand why so many unfamiliar countries appear on historical maps, it helps to remember how unstable the political world once was. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the global map was constantly shifting. Empires expanded and collapsed. Colonies were founded and lost. Revolutions created new nations almost overnight. In many parts of the world, political borders were far less stable than they are today. The historical record shows that this period was marked by continuous conflict and transformation. European powers were engaged in colonial wars across several continents. Territories changed hands through treaties, uprisings, and military campaigns. At the same time, older empires were beginning to weaken, creating opportunities for new states to appear. Because of this, national borders could change very quickly. A region that belonged to one empire one decade might become part of a completely different political entity just a few years later. In some cases, entirely new countries emerged after revolutions or political agreements. Some historians point to several examples that illustrate how rapidly these changes could occur. The Kingdom of Westphalia, for instance, was created in the early 19th century during the Napoleonic period. It appeared suddenly as part of a new political order in Europe, and for a short time it existed as a recognized state. But its lifespan was brief. Within only a few years, it disappeared as the political situation in Europe shifted again. Other examples come from the Americas. The Confederate States of America existed for only a short period during the American Civil War. The Republic of Texas also had a relatively brief existence as an independent nation before becoming part of the United States. In each of these cases, a country existed long enough to be recognized internationally and to appear on contemporary maps. Yet the lifespan of these states was surprisingly short. Some lasted only a few years. Others survived for less than a decade. When historians examine maps from this era, they often reveal a world that was changing at remarkable speed. Borders expanded, contracted, and sometimes vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. In a time like this, it is perhaps not surprising that some countries appear on maps only briefly before fading into history. When researchers began to examine historical maps more closely, they did not rely on just one or two examples. Instead, they compared large collections of maps created across different countries and across different centuries. Some of these collections included hundreds of maps, each drawn by different cartographers working in different periods. When these maps were placed side by side, certain patterns slowly began to emerge. One of the most interesting observations was that some countries appeared almost simultaneously on maps produced in completely different parts of Europe. A cartographer in France might include a certain name on a map, while a map created in England or Germany during the same period would show a very similar label in roughly the same region. This suggests that the idea of these places was widely accepted at the time. Another pattern becomes visible when looking at how these names disappear. In many cases, a particular country name remains present on maps for decades. Then, over the course of a relatively short period, the label begins to change. On some maps, it becomes smaller or shifts position. On others, it disappears entirely. Sometimes the name itself does not vanish, but instead transforms into something else. A term that once described a large political territory might gradually become the name of a geographic region. Later, it may survive only as a historical reference or as part of a broader administrative area. A well-known example can be seen in the changing names used to describe large parts of northern Asia. Earlier maps often referred to enormous territories using the name Tartary or Tartaria. Over time, that label begins to fade from new editions of maps. In later periods, the same lands appear under different descriptions such as Central Asia, Siberia, or as part of the expanding Russian Empire. When these maps are arranged in chronological order, the transformation becomes surprisingly clear. Borders shift, names move, entire regions are redefined. The maps themselves almost function like a time-lapse record of political geography. They reveal how the way people described the world could change within just a few decades. And as these names evolve, they quietly document how political realities were constantly being rewritten on the map. When researchers begin to examine large collections of historical maps, individual examples start to matter less than the broader patterns that appear across many documents. Looking at a single map can be misleading, but when dozens or even hundreds of maps are compared across different centuries, certain repeating features slowly become visible. One of the most noticeable patterns is the appearance of enormous regions that are labeled as if they were single political entities. These areas often cover vast territories but lack clear internal borders. Instead of showing many separate states, the map presents one large name stretched across an entire region. A well-known example of this is the label Tartaria, which appears across huge sections of northern Asia on many European maps. The territory marked with this name is enormous, yet the borders are often vague or undefined. Another pattern involves countries that existed for only a very short period of time. In some cases, a political state might appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly. Yet even brief states could find their way onto maps if they were recognized during that moment. The Republic of Texas is one example. For a short time in the 19th century, it existed as an independent country before eventually becoming part of the United States. The Kingdom of Westphalia offers another case. Created during the Napoleonic period, it existed only briefly before vanishing as Europe's political order shifted again. There is also a third pattern that appears in many historical maps. Sometimes the name written across a region may not represent a formal country at all. Instead, it might describe a cultural, political, or geographic zone. Ancient names such as Scythia were often used this way. They did not always refer to a unified state, but rather to a broad region associated with certain peoples or traditions. Some historians suggest that terms like Tartaria may have functioned in a similar way on older maps. Rather than describing a single organized country, the name might have been used to identify a large and loosely defined region. In this sense, the maps were not necessarily incorrect. They were simply reflecting how the world was understood at the time. As the investigation continues, it becomes clear that disappearing countries are not limited to one region or one historical moment. When historians begin looking across different continents, similar examples appear again and again. Old maps from Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia all contain traces of political entities that once existed, yet today are rarely discussed. In Europe, one example often mentioned by researchers is the Republic of Ragusa. For centuries, this small maritime republic controlled an important trading port along the Adriatic Sea. It maintained diplomatic relationships and survived between larger powers. Yet by the early 19th century, the republic disappeared from the political map as new states reorganized the region. Today, its name survives mostly in historical records and in the modern city of Dubrovnik. Another example is the Duchy of Courland, a small state that once existed along the Baltic Sea. At one time, it was influential enough to establish distant colonial outposts overseas. Over time, it too was absorbed into larger empires and gradually vanished from modern political geography. Similar stories can be found across the Atlantic. In North America, Maps from the early 19th century sometimes show entities such as the Republic of West Florida, a short-lived state that existed briefly during a period of political unrest. In other cases, small political projects, such as the Republic of Sonora, appeared for a moment before disappearing almost as quickly as they were created. In Africa, historical maps often reference the Sultanate of Zanzibar, which once played a role in regional trade across the Indian Ocean. Over time, its independent status faded as colonial powers reshaped the political landscape. Asia provides another example in the form of the Kingdom of Ryukyu. For centuries, this island kingdom maintained its own identity and diplomatic relationships with larger powers in the region. Eventually, it was absorbed into modern Japan. Some of these states survived for hundreds of years. Others lasted only briefly. But once they disappear, their presence is often preserved mainly through the maps that recorded them. Historical maps become quiet archives of countries the world has largely forgotten. When historians study the strange appearance and disappearance of countries on old maps, they usually begin with a simple explanation. The past was far less stable than the modern world. Political borders changed constantly, sometimes within just a few years. Empires expanded and collapsed. Small states appeared after revolutions or wars and then vanished just as quickly. In such a fragmented political landscape, it is not surprising that many names appeared on maps for only a short time. Some historians suggest that the maps themselves also played a role in this phenomenon. In earlier centuries, cartographers often relied heavily on existing maps created by others. A respected mapmaker in one country might publish a widely used map, and other cartographers would copy its information, sometimes repeating mistakes without realizing it. Over time, these copied details could spread across Europe, giving certain places an appearance of permanence even if the information was uncertain. Another explanation focuses on the nature of the names themselves. Not every label on an old map referred to a formal state with clear borders and governments. In some cases, what appears to be a country was actually a broad geographic or cultural region. Names such as Scythia or Tartaria may have been used by European mapmakers simply to describe vast and unfamiliar territories. There is also the possibility that some of these places were once real political entities that later faded from historical memory. Over generations, wars, annexations, and changing borders can erase smaller states from the common narrative of history. Their institutions disappear, their names are replaced, and eventually only fragments remain. Old maps quietly preserve these fragments. They capture moments when the political world looked very different from the one we know today. When we look at old maps today, it becomes clear that the world they show is very different from the one we know. Borders shift constantly. Names appear, spread across large territories, and then quietly vanish. Entire countries seem to rise into existence and later dissolve into something else. Sometimes this process takes centuries. Sometimes it happens surprisingly quickly, within the span of a few decades. The historical record shows that the political landscape of the past was far more fluid than the modern world. Empires expanded and collapsed. New states were formed through wars, revolutions, and negotiations. Others were absorbed by larger powers or gradually transformed into regions with new names. Over time, many of these places disappeared not only from maps, but also from everyday historical memory. Some historians suggest that old maps function almost like time capsules. Each one captures a specific moment, freezing a version of the world that existed for a brief period. When we compare maps from different years, we begin to see how quickly the political geography of the planet could change. And yet, when studying these maps closely, there is often a strange feeling. The lines and names do not only represent geography, they also hint at forgotten political worlds that once shaped the lives of millions of people. This raises an interesting question. How many countries from the past still remain hidden in old maps and forgotten atlases, waiting to be noticed again by those willing to look carefully?